Greetings, boys and girls. It is so good to be back with you again today for our study, Growing Wise with Proverbs. And before we jump into our study for the day, I want to ask you, did you do your homework last week? Last week, you were supposed to read Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 20 with mom or dad or some adult that can help you read it. And look for some commandments there and look for some wisdom there. Did you do that? And I hope you were able to find some commands, even if they didn't always look like commandments. God sometimes tells us to do things in a way that sounds a little different than a command. And then what wisdom did you find there? You know, wisdom teaches us to love and to fear God. So anything in that passage that teaches us to love and fear God is wisdom. And the reason I ask you to do that is it was a bit of an exercise, right? We've been talking about the commandments of God and treasuring His commandments and keeping His commandments. We saw that last week and the week before a little bit with the Father teaching the Son. So today I want to move on to that last question that we asked you to do last week in your homework, and that is, how can I learn to love God's commandments? You were supposed to ask yourself that question after reading Matthew 5. How can I learn to love God's commandments? Now, that may sound like a really strange question because most of us don't like commandments at all. We don't like being told what to do by anyone. Are you always happy when your mom or your dad ask you to do a chore or when they ask you to do something, maybe when you're right in the middle of playing with your friends? Well, that's not always fun. But you know, the writer of Proverbs wants us not just to obey God's commandments, to know God's commandments. He wants us to love God's commandments. And so let me share with you some verses from Proverbs here from chapter 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 6, for example, verse 20, the writer says, "My son, obey your father's commands and don't neglect your mother's instruction. Keep their words always in your heart. Tie them around your neck." Now, why would you tie something around your neck? Well, it's because it's something that's precious, you want to keep close to you, or it's because it's something very, very valuable, right, that you want to guard. And so you might tie something around your neck for those reasons, and that's what he says we should do with God's commands. How about Proverbs chapter 7, verses 1 through 4? Listen to what he says here. "Follow my advice, my son, and always treasure my commands. Obey my commands and live. Guard my instructions as you guard your own eyes." So he says two things to us there in those first two verses. He says, treasure my commands. In other words, treat my commandments like a treasure, something you would hide away and guard and make sure you keep it close so you can always watch over it. You want to treasure God's commands. And then he says, guard my instructions like you would your own eyes. Now, boys and girls, if I were to come to you Sunday and say, "Hey, you've got a little something in your eye. Let me get it out for you," and started putting my finger close to your eye, what would you do? Would you hold your eye wide open and let me put my finger in there, or would you start doing that because you didn't really want my finger to touch your eye? Right? We're instinctively programmed to sort of protect our eyes. And so he says, guard my commandments the way you would guard your own eyes and protect them. And then the final verse here in Proverbs 8, verses 10 and 11, says, "Choose my instruction rather than silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold. For wisdom is far more valuable than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with it." So boys and girls, here, God's commands and instruction and wisdom and knowledge are all compared to things like silver and gold and rubies. You know what a ruby is? It's kind of a precious stone that's red. Those things are all very valuable. And so the writer of Proverbs wants you not just to know God's commands and to keep God's commandments. He wants you to love and treasure God's commands. Now, the question is, how can we do that? How can we learn not just to obey, but to love the commandments of God, okay? And I'm going to give you three things that you can talk about with your moms and dads that will help you to learn to love God's commands. The first one is continue to read and memorize God's commandments. You know, sometimes we learn to love something the more we're around it, the more we're exposed to it. And so, for example, your mom and dad might take you to Disney World or to Busch Gardens or somewhere where they have these big roller coasters. And you look at it and you're afraid of it and you're not sure you want to ride it, but you think you might because people seem to be having fun with it. And the first time you get on it, it scares you so bad and you're so afraid and you don't think you'll ever enjoy something like that. But then later on, you think, I think I'd like to try that again, because deep down you really enjoyed it and you learn to enjoy it over time. Sometimes we see this in the kind of foods we eat. Do you boys and girls remember when I brought you some candy from Finland? Do you remember it was black and I let you try that candy? How many of you liked it? Do you remember? I don't remember that any of you really liked it. And yet the boys and girls in Finland love it. Why? Well, it's because it's what they've been given since they were little. They eat candy with that black stuff on it. They eat ice cream that has that licorice in it. So they've learned to love it because it's what they've known. And so sometimes we don't love God's commands because we don't read and listen to God's commands, and we don't expose ourselves to it. If you read God's commands every day, before long you learn to love them better. Well, the second thing is to pray and ask God's help in changing our hearts. Our hearts don't always love what they're supposed to, and that's true of moms and dads as well as boys and girls. And so we have to guard and guide our hearts. Now, one of the ways we do that is by asking God to change our hearts. Remember, our hearts teach us about what we love and what we treasure the most. And so we want to ask God to change our heart to teach us to love the things that we should love. In fact, this is what God promised He would do for us in the Old Testament. He tells us that the covenant that He would make with us, His new covenant that He made through Jesus, is that He would put His laws on our heart and write them on our minds. So He knows that we need His laws inside of us, and He's promised to do that for us. So even when we have a new heart, we're going to be tempted to love things that we shouldn't. And so we always have to trust God to change our hearts, even as we work hard to love the things that we should. And then finally, I'm going to give you one other thing that you can do to help you love God's commandments more, and that is to learn to love God more. When we love someone, we don't mind doing things for them at all. We want that person to be happy, and we want them to be happy with us. And so we do everything we can to make them happy. You know what it's like to show love for other people, right? Sometimes you might do something nice for one of your friends, or you might give something to a brother or a sister or a cousin or a friend at school, or you might show love for your mom and dad by doing something nice for them. You might do some chores without even being asked to do it. How about listening to your teachers at school? Or being respectful even to people that you don't know all that well, right? When we get to know someone, when we do something nice for someone, it causes us to love them more, and it causes us to want to do more good things for them. So learn to love God's commandments by learning to love God. One day, boys and girls, you're going to get married, and you're going to have, if God intends this for you, you're going to have a husband or a wife, and you're going to do wonderful things for them just because you love them. You're going to bring your wife flowers maybe, or your husband, you're going to do something nice for him just to show that you love him. And so when you learn to love God, you're going to be much more prone to obey His commandments, okay? So that's our lesson for today. If you want to learn to love God's commands, work on these three things with moms and dads. Continue to read and memorize God's commandments. Pray and ask for God to help change your heart when you don't love the things that you should. And learn to love God, because the more you love God, the more you'll want to please Him and do good things like obeying His commandments, okay? Now, next week, I have a little bit of homework for you as well. Next week, I want you through the week, you don't have to do it all at one time, but I want you to just read through Proverbs chapter 8 with your moms and dads, because next week, we will get to meet a very, very special lady, okay? So I want you to be ready to talk about this and think about it with me together as we read Proverbs chapter 8 together, okay? I love you, boys and girls. It's good to see you at church this past Sunday, and I hope to see you all again real soon. God bless.